The fog clung to the ground like a living thing, wrapping itself around the long runways of East Anglia as the first engines rumbled awake. In that cold October dawn, the men of the 8th Air Force stood beside their B-17 seconds, breath turning to frost, jackets stiff with the night's moisture. They checked their guns and oxygen lines, tightened their gloves, and tried often unsuccessfully to quiet the instinct that told them the truth. Many would not return. They knew what waited beyond the English coast. A sky filled with flak and fighters, a battlefield where aluminum burned like paper, and where a single mistake, one frozen gun, one sputtering engine, could send 10 men falling toward the fields of Germany. Yet they climbed aboard anyway, driven by a mission that commanders insisted could change the war itself, strike the heart of Germany's ball-bearing industry, and cripple the machinery of the Reich. What forced them into a mission so lethal that survival odds hovered near 35%? Why did leaders keep sending men into a storm that seemed impossible to outfly? To understand the answer and the turning point that followed, we must go back to the morning when courage met catastrophe in the skies over Schweinfurt. The mission to Schweinfurt did not emerge from desperation alone. It came from a cold, mathematical truth at the center of German industry. Deep inside Bavaria, the factories of Schweinfurt produced the ball bearings that kept the Reich's war machine turning tiny steel spheres that made tank turrets rotate, aircraft propellers spin, submarine periscopes rise, and artillery traverse with lethal precision. Without them, Germany's mechanized warfare would seize like an engine without oil. To American planners, Schweinfurt was not just a target, it was the fulcrum on which an entire war might pivot. But reaching it required flying straight into the jaws of the Luftwaffe. By mid-1943, crews of the 8th Air Force understood the cost of deep penetration raids better than any statistic could express. Empty bunks appeared in their Nissen huts with unsettling regularity. Personal effects, photos, watches, letters folded with care were packed up for shipment home. And every new briefing reminded them of a truth whispered in mess halls and written in letters that would never be sent. Bomber crews had only about a 1 in 3 chance of surviving their required 25 missions. Yet U.S. doctrine insisted the bomber could defend itself. The B-17 Flying Fortress bristled with 50 caliber guns, 13 in total, overlapping fields of fire that planners believed could repel any interceptor. Combat box formations, layered high, middle, low, promised mutual protection. On paper, the system looked unbreakable. But in the skies over Germany, the Luftwaffe had already begun to dismantle that theory piece by piece. The double strike of the 17th of August 1943 exposed every weakness. The plan was elegant. One force would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg and continue south to bases in North Africa, while a second force hit the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt before returning to England. In theory, German fighters would be forced to split. In reality, fog smothered the airfields of the Schweinfurt force. Hours slipped away as bombers waited on runways they could barely see. Regensburg flew on schedule, alone. German radar detected them immediately, and every available Luftwaffe unit launched to intercept. By the time the delayed Schweinfurt formation finally crossed into Germany, the same fighters refueled, rearmed, reinforced were waiting for them again. 60 bombers never returned. 600 airmen were killed, captured, or lost to the sea. For the Americans, the raid was a strategic lesson written in fire. Without long-range escort, daylight bombing was not merely hazardous, it was unsustainable. Yet the target remained vital. Schweinfurt still produced nearly half of Germany's ball-bearing supply. Destroying it could have slowed the Reich more than any battlefield victory. And so the 8th Air Force prepared to try again, knowing full well what awaited them across the channel. The stage was set. The enemy was ready. The doctrine was breaking, and the men of the 8th Air Force were ordered back into the storm. The sun had barely risen when the bomber stream crossed the Dutch coast, but already the men inside the flying fortresses felt the weight of what was coming. Frost clung to the inside of their oxygen masks. The air temperature had dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Even the smallest wound could freeze before a bandage was applied. Yet it was not the cold that tightened their chests. It was the moment the P-47 Thunderbolts waggled their wings, turned west, and disappeared. Fuel. That single constraint dictated everything. At 11 a.m., the escorts turned back toward England, their tanks nearly dry. For the next 3 hours, the B-17 seconds would be utterly alone in the most dangerous airspace in the world. At 11:13, the first wave came. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds descended like blades falling from the sun, dropping from 30,000 feet in tight formations of 4. They aimed straight for the nose of the bomber stream, the weak point planners once dismissed as statistically insignificant. To the Germans, it was the key. At closing speeds over 500 miles per hour, They held their fire until they reached 300 yards, then unleashed all four 20mm cannons at once. The flashes looked like sparks on an anvil. The effect was catastrophic. The first B-17 died almost instantly. A cannon shell smashed into the No-2 engine, turning it into a fireball. Flames crawled across the wing like a living thing, weakening its structure until it snapped off at the root. The bomber inverted, tumbled violently, and spiraled downward, trapping most of the crew under crushing G-forces. Only 4 parachutes opened. There was no time to grieve. Another wave was already inbound. Focke-Wulf 190 seconds hammered the formation from the flanks and rear, aiming at the outboard engines, the Achilles heel of the flying fortress. Knock out both engines on one wing, and physics completed the kill. A bomber falling behind the formation became a wounded animal. The Luftwaffe hunted stragglers mercilessly, swarming them from every angle with the precision of predators who had perfected their craft over 4 years of war. The sky grew thick with smoke trails and falling aluminum. Some bombers exploded outright when cannon shells struck their bomb bays. Others burned for agonizing minutes, spiraling downward while men bailed out into a sky lit by fire. Some parachutes opened, some didn't. Still, the formation pushed on. Still, the mission had to be done. At 1440, after hours of relentless combat, the surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt. Below them, the city bristled with 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Black puffs of flak erupted around the aircraft, each burst a ball of shrapnel that could shred through aluminum like cloth. The bombers had no choice but to fly straight and level for nearly 3 minutes, locked into the unbreakable discipline required by the Norden bomb site. Men held their breath. Metal screamed. Holes tore open in wings and fuselages. But the bombs felled tons of explosives raining down onto the ball-bearing factories that powered the Reich. Schweinfurt burned. Yet the hardest part remained, the long flight home. German fighters continued their assault until ammunition ran dry. Some pilots flew 3 or 4 sorties against the same bomber stream. Only when fresh P-47 seconds finally appeared in the late afternoon did the Luftwaffe break away, leaving the survivors to limp back toward England, some so damaged they fell into the sea within sight of home. Black Thursday had carved its place into history. The mission was completed, but the cost was staggering. By the time the surviving B-17 seconds crossed back over the North Sea, the men inside them already knew the truth. Schweinfurt had not been a victory. It had been a reckoning. The formations that had left England with disciplined symmetry returned in fractured clusters, engines coughing smoke, gun barrels warped from hours of fire. Some aircraft limped along on one remaining engine. Others trailed fuel that glimmered briefly in the fading light before disappearing into the sea air. And some never returned at all. Across East Anglia, ground crews waited on the dispersal pads, scanning the horizon for silhouettes that failed to appear. The first bombers landed at 1745, their fuselages stitched with cannon holes, their tires blown, their wings buckled. Ambulances moved immediately toward the parking stands. Some planes carried wounded men who had bled through their heated suits. Others had silent passengers, airmen who had died hours earlier, their bodies frozen stiff at altitude. When the final tally came in, it was worse than anyone expected. 60 B-17 seconds lost, 17 more damaged beyond repair, 77 aircraft gone, 26% of the entire strike force, 650 men dead, wounded, or missing. Black Thursday had become the single costliest mission in the history of the 8th Air Force. And what had the sacrifice achieved? The bombs had fallen accurately. Fires raged inside the factories of Schweinfurt. Production reports showed a short-term drop of roughly 34% in ball-bearing output. But within weeks, the German Armaments Ministry quietly restored production levels. Stockpiles, emergency shifts, and imports from neutral countries filled the gap. The strategic blow, so costly, so desperately bought, had landed softer than American planners had hoped. Inside 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe, the atmosphere shifted from determination to urgency. The post-mission reports were blunt. Bomber groups wrote detailed accounts of frontal attacks, massed formations of fighters, and catastrophic losses among unescorted aircraft. Intelligence summaries described what the men already knew from experience. The Luftwaffe could refuel, rearm, and attack again long before bombers reached the coast. Every factor pointed to the same conclusion. Daylight strategic bombing without long-range fighter escort was not simply flawed, it was failing catastrophically. The tragedy of Black Thursday forced a fundamental reckoning. The bomber doctrine that America had championed for years, the belief that a flying fortress could fight its way to any target in Germany, had been disproven in blood. Even the aircraft themselves, magnificent as they were, could not survive 3 hours alone against seasoned German pilots armed with optimized tactics and overwhelming numbers. The 8th Air Force had a choice: continue as they were and face destruction, or find a way to escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. Yet the answer did not exist in the skies, at least not yet. The P-47 lacked the range. The P-38 struggled in the freezing air at high altitude. The RAF had already abandoned daylight bombing for night raids. Somewhere, somehow, the Americans would need a fighter that could fly 1,000 miles, battle German interceptors over their home territory, and then bring its pilot home alive. The cost of Schweinfurt demanded nothing less. In the aftermath of Black Thursday, the United States confronted a truth that was impossible to ignore. Courage alone could not win the air war over Europe. What the 8th Air Force needed was not more bombers or more resolve. It needed a transformation, one that would reshape strategy, doctrine, and the very structure of aerial combat. That transformation began in January 1944, the moment Lieutenant General James Doolittle assumed command. Doolittle understood something his predecessors had resisted. Defending bombers was not enough. To defeat the Luftwaffe, the Americans would have to hunt it on every flight path, at every altitude, even on the ground. Under his leadership, fighter groups were freed from the rigid requirement to stay welded to the bomber formations. P-51 Mustangs, with their unprecedented range and high-altitude performance, were authorized to sweep far ahead, dive deep behind, and strike the Luftwaffe wherever it gathered strength. Air superiority would not be granted, it would be taken. The world felt the shift almost immediately. Operation Argument, later known simply as Big Week, put the new doctrine to a brutal test. Between February 20 and 25, 1,944, thousands of American bombers, escorted by swarms of Mustangs, assaulted Germany's aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe was forced into the open, sending its most experienced squadrons to defend the industrial backbone of the Reich. The result was devastating. Germany lost hundreds of fighters and nearly 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots in less than a week. Their training programs, starved of fuel and resources, could not replace them. For the Allies, Big Week was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point recognized across the globe. British commanders observed that the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was beginning to break under the relentless weight of American air power. Soviet leaders, fighting their own life and death struggle on the Eastern Front, welcomed the pressure that pulled German aircraft and pilots away from their skies. Even neutral nations took note of the shifting balance. The air superiority that had once belonged to the Axis was now rapidly eroding. For the United States, the implications were profound. Doolittle's doctrine and the arrival of the P-51 Mustang had altered the trajectory of the war. Missions that once cost dozens of bombers now lost only a handful. For the first time, aircrews felt something approaching hope, a belief that they might actually complete their tours and return home alive. The air war had entered a new phase, and its consequences would soon reshape the entire course of the conflict in Europe. When the guns finally fell silent over Europe in May 1945, the men of the 8th Air Force looked back on a campaign carved in fire, smoke, and sacrifice. They had fought an enemy determined to hold the skies above its homeland, an enemy that for years had claimed mastery of altitude and speed. Yet through innovation, resilience, and a fighter that changed the very geometry of air combat, the 8th Air Force achieved what once seemed impossible: complete and uncontested air superiority over the heart of Nazi Germany. That victory, however, came at a price that echoes long beyond the war itself. More than 26,000 American airmen never made it home. Another 28,000 would endure the uncertainty and hardship of prisoner of war camps. Over 4,700 heavy bombers were lost, each one carrying 10 men who entrusted their lives to aluminum skins and the courage of those beside them. These were not abstract numbers. They were fathers who never returned, brothers whose letters stopped without warning, husbands whose children would grow up knowing them only through photographs and folded flags. Yet out of this immense cost emerged a legacy that still shapes modern air power. The introduction of the P-51 Mustang proved that technology, when matched with the right strategy, can alter the fate of nations. It extended the reach of American air power deep into enemy territory, shattered the Luftwaffe's ability to contest the skies, and opened the door for the D-Day landings and every major Allied advance that followed. The Mustang did more than escort bombers. It gave thousands of men a chance to live, to return home, to build the post-war world their sacrifices made possible. Today, when we look back on those long, freezing flights over Germany, we see not only the mechanics of air warfare, but the enduring weight of human courage. We see crews who climbed aboard their aircraft knowing the odds, yet flew anyway. We see engineers who refused to accept limitations, commanders who adapted when doctrine failed, and a nation that learned hard lessons about the cost of freedom. The skies they fought over are quiet now, but the legacy of the 8th Air Force endures, written in the freedom secured, in the strategies refined, and in the lives saved by a fighter that arrived just in time. What lesson, in your view, stands out most from this chapter of the air war? Share your thoughts below. We read every comment. And if you wish to continue exploring the battles that shaped our world, consider joining us for the next story in this long, unfinished history.